Redditor 1. It was a story my father only ever told me once, late at night when the house was quiet, and he thought no one else was listening. His voice was low, his tone measured, the way it always was when he was reliving something he wasn't quite sure how to explain. It was 1982, and he was stationed on a military base in New Brunswick, a place tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the world, where the night stretched endlessly and the trees whispered in the wind. One evening, just after the sun had dipped below the horizon, his best friend and the friend's girlfriend had decided to go see Tron. The nearest theater was a good drive away, but the lure of a new sci-fi movie was enough to make the journey worth it. They waved goodbye to my father, hopped into the car, and drove off into the descending darkness. An hour later, they were back. My father knew something was wrong the moment he saw their car pull into the lot. The once pristine vehicle was a mess, dented, scratched, and covered in streaks of paint in colors that didn't belong to it. His friend and the girlfriend stepped out, their faces pale, their movements stiff with fear. My father asked them what had happened, why they hadn't gone to the movie. But they brushed him off, mumbling something about needing sleep, and disappeared into the barracks. The image of their battered car stuck in his mind, as did the way they looked, shaken, like they'd seen something they couldn't put into words. It was days before his friend finally opened up and told him the truth, the story spilling out in hushed tones, as though saying it aloud might bring the thing back. They'd been driving along a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but trees and rolling hills, the kind of road where you could drive for miles without seeing another soul. The night was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Then, as they rounded a bend, they saw it. At first it was just a glow, strange lights coming from over the crest of a hill. The lights were vibrant, unnatural, dancing against the dark sky in hues that didn't belong. There was no town nearby, no houses, no reason for lights to be there. Curious and a little uneasy, they drove closer. At the base of the hill was a small parking lot, the kind used for trailheads or scenic overlooks. Other cars were already pulling in, their occupants clearly drawn by the same bizarre display. Without thinking, my father's friend pulled in as well, parking alongside the others. They got out of the car and joined the growing crowd, all of them staring up at the hill with a mix of wonder and trepidation. The air felt charged, heavy with an energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Someone suggested hiking to the top to get a better look, and the group began to move, drawn toward the source of the lights. Then it appeared. A disc, massive and gleaming, rose over the hill's peak. It was adorned with flashing lights that pulsed in a mesmerizing rhythm, casting strange shadows across the trees and the gathered crowd. The sound came next, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in their chests, an otherworldly noise that made the very air feel alive. For a moment, there was only stunned silence as the group stared, frozen in place by the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. Then the panic set in. Everyone ran for their cars, a chaotic scramble as people fought to escape. The parking lot's narrow entrance became a choke point, with vehicles jostling for position, scraping against each other in their desperation to get out. Mirrors snapped off, paint was traded, and the sound of crunching metal echoed through the chaos. My father's friend and his girlfriend managed to wedge their car into the fray, the disc still looming overhead. The light it cast was blinding, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening, as if it were reacting to the pandemonium below. They didn't look back, too focused on forcing their way out of the lot and speeding back to the base. When they finally arrived, hearts pounding and minds racing, they didn't know what to do. What could they say? Who would believe them? The fear lingered, palpable, even as they tried to push the memory aside and return to the mundane routine of military life. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, my father's friend took him back to the spot where it had happened. The parking lot was eerily quiet, the air still heavy with the memory of that night. Scattered across the ground were broken mirrors, scraps of paint, and other debris, evidence of the chaotic escape. But there was no sign of the lights, no hint of the disc that had risen over the hill. It was as though it had never been there at all. And then the men in black arrived. They showed up on the base unannounced, their presence a stark contrast to the casual camaraderie of the soldiers. Dressed impeccably in dark suits, they moved with an air of authority, their expressions unreadable. They sought out my father's friend, pulling him aside for a private conversation. When he returned, his face was pale, his hands trembling. My father pressed him for answers, but the friend refused to say much. "They told me to shut up," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said if I wanted to keep my career, I'd better forget everything and never speak of it again." The warning hung heavy in the air, a silencing force that squashed any further questions. My father never pushed for more details, sensing that his friend was already carrying a weight too great to bear. Years later, when my father told me the story, his voice was tinged with a mix of awe and unease. He didn't claim to know what had happened that night, or what the lights had been. But he was certain of one thing. Whatever his friend and the others had seen, it was something they were never meant to witness. And to this day, the memory of that battered car, the fear in his friend's eyes, and the debris-strewn parking lot remain etched in his mind as a reminder that there are things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that defy explanation. Redditor 2. My grandfather's story has haunted me for years, not because it's terrifying in the traditional sense, but because it leaves a hole in the fabric of what I thought was reality. He wasn't the type to spin tall tales. He was a practical man, someone who lived his entire life working hard and valuing truth over embellishment. Yet this story, which he swore by until the day he died, left even the most skeptical villagers scratching their heads. And more importantly, these villagers effectively built a lie to themselves to keep safety. It was sometime between 1935 and 1945 in a remote village in northern Iraq. Back then, time wasn't measured by calendars or clocks. Days were marked by the rising and setting of the sun, by the seasons and by the rhythm of work and rest. Summers were for toiling in the fields and preparing for the harsh winters that would force everyone indoors. Winters were for rest, family gatherings, and weddings. Lots of weddings. This story takes place at one such wedding. The entire village had gathered at the reception, crammed into the largest building available, celebrating the union of two families. My grandfather was among the guests, enjoying the warmth of food, drink, and community. The atmosphere was joyous, filled with music and the sound of feet stomping to traditional songs. The singer, the centerpiece of the entertainment, was a man known for his captivating voice and lively demeanor. But on this night, something happened that no one could have anticipated. The singer excused himself to relieve himself, as was normal during long celebrations. In those days, there were no modern bathrooms or conveniences. If nature called, you walked to the designated waste area outside the village. It was a trek, a 5-minute walk in freezing conditions, digging a hole in the snow to do your business and then covering it before heading back. It was inconvenient but necessary, and no one thought twice when the singer left. At first, no one noticed his absence. The music continued, the guests ate and laughed, and the celebration carried on. But as time passed, whispers began to spread. He had been gone too long, an hour or more, and concerns started to grow. What if he had slipped on the ice? What if he had gotten lost or hurt? My grandfather, along with a few others, decided to go look for him. The snow was pristine, a thick white blanket that reflected the moonlight, making the night almost glow. My grandfather followed the singer's footprints, which were easy to spot in the otherwise untouched snow. They led straight to the edge of the designated area, but then something strange happened. The track stopped abruptly. There were no signs of a fall, no marks in the snow where he might have squatted, no evidence that he had turned around. It was as if he had simply vanished. Puzzled and uneasy, my grandfather returned to the wedding to report what he had found. By then, the entire gathering was anxious, the once joyous atmosphere replaced with unease. Then, just as suddenly as he had disappeared, the singer walked back in. He looked pale, his expression dazed, and his normally vibrant energy was subdued. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. The groom, furious and worried in equal measure, demanded to know where he had been. Some of the women, who had feared the worst, began to cry in relief. My grandfather watched as the singer stood there, shivering slightly, before finally speaking. "Your difficulty." What he said next silenced the entire room. He told them that as he was walking to the waste area, he had been approached by two figures. They came up behind him, their presence so sudden and strange that he didn't know what to do. They weren't like anyone he'd ever seen before, tall and otherworldly, their features hard to describe. Their voices were calm, almost soothing, as they asked him a question. "Do you want to go somewhere far?" Confused and startled, he asked them what they meant. They replied, "How about China?" Before he could fully process what was happening, a craft, what he described as a floating, glowing vehicle, descended silently from the sky. It hovered just above the ground, radiating a light that was both blinding and mesmerizing. The two figures took him by the arms and led him inside. He didn't resist, though he couldn't explain why. It was as if he were compelled, his fear overridden by a strange sense of calm. Once inside, the craft ascended rapidly, faster than anything he could imagine. Through the windows, he saw the earth shrinking beneath him, the vast landscape blurring into a tapestry of colors. Then, just as suddenly, they were descending again. When the craft landed, the figures told him he could explore for a while. He stepped outside and found himself in a place that was nothing like the snowy mountains of his village. The air was warm, the ground dry, and flowers of every imaginable color stretched out before him. He wandered, awestruck, through this strange and beautiful place. He didn't see anyone else, but the tranquility of the scene made him feel oddly at peace. Before long, he returned to the craft, carrying a small bouquet of flowers as a keepsake. The figures smiled, and moments later they were back in the snowy mountains of northern Iraq. He walked back to the wedding, dazed and unsure if what had happened was real. But the flowers in his hand were proof. Vivid, fragrant blossoms that had no business existing in the dead of winter, in a place where nothing could grow in the frozen soil. The room erupted into chaos. Some people laughed nervously, dismissing his story as drunken nonsense. Others whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the flowers and the singer. My grandfather, along with a few others, approached to examine the bouquet. The flowers were real, their petals soft and vibrant, glistening with dew. There was no denying it. These flowers weren't from around here. In the days that followed, the story spread through the village like wildfire. Some dismissed it outright, unwilling to entertain the possibility of something so bizarre. Others believed it wholeheartedly, pointing to the flowers as undeniable proof. My grandfather, who had seen those flowers with his own eyes, was among the latter. The singer never wavered in his account. He repeated the story to anyone who asked, his tone unwavering and his eyes filled with conviction. Over time, the flowers wilted, but the memory of that night never faded. To this day, the older generation in the village speaks of it in hushed tones, a strange and inexplicable event that defies logic. My grandfather swore it was true, and I have no reason to doubt him. He wasn't the type to embellish or seek attention. And besides, how could those flowers have appeared otherwise? It's a story that leaves more questions than answers, a mystery that lingers in the cold mountain air of northern Iraq. Whether you believe it or not, one thing is certain. Something extraordinary happened that night. Redditor 3. The winter night in eastern Iowa was one of those crisp, silent evenings where the world seemed to hold its breath. My buddy had invited me and another friend out to his family's place for Thanksgiving. It wasn't an offer we could refuse. Home-cooked meals, a quiet escape from the chaos of campus, and a chance to stargaze under the clearest skies we'd ever seen. He lived in a remote area, far from city lights, a place where stars seemed to spill endlessly across the sky. On the second night of our visit, after stuffing ourselves with turkey and pie, we decided to head out to a field nearby to look at the stars. It was a place he'd raved about, promising we'd never seen anything like it. He wasn't wrong. The field was vast, the knee-high grass rustling softly in the cold November wind. We stood there, necks craned upward, staring at a canvas of stars brighter than any I'd seen before. Shooting stars streaked across the sky, and for a while everything felt magical. It was the kind of moment that makes you feel small but in a comforting way, like you're part of something bigger. Then my friend pointed to a light in the sky. "What's that?" he asked. We all turned to look. It was bright, brighter than the stars and stationary. But it wasn't a plane or a satellite. It had an odd, almost unnatural quality to it. My friend, who was into astronomy, said it looked like a planet, but he was certain there weren't any visible planets that night. He knew his stuff, so if he was stumped, it had to be something. As we watched, the light began to move. It wasn't like the smooth trajectory of a satellite or the steady blinking of an airplane. It bobbed up and down, almost as if it were floating on invisible waves. It moved in ways that didn't make sense, defying anything we knew about objects in the sky. Then it fizzled out. It didn't fade like a dying ember or disappear into the horizon. It literally burned out, like a candle blown out by a gust of wind. For a moment, we stood there in stunned silence, staring at the spot where it had been. My friend tried to rationalize it. Maybe a meteor breaking apart in the atmosphere? But even he didn't sound convinced. We joked nervously about seeing a UFO, but deep down, we all felt uneasy. That's when we saw him. At first, it didn't register. In the vast openness of the field, the figure seemed to materialize out of nowhere. He was sitting a good distance away, curled up on the ground with his arms wrapped around his knees. In the dim starlight, I could see he wasn't wearing a shirt or shoes, just a pair of jeans. He was shivering, his bare torso pale in the cold November air. We stopped dead in our tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. How had we not seen him before? The field was flat with no trees or rocks to obscure our view. We'd been there for at least an hour, and he hadn't been there earlier. "Hey," my friend called out, his voice cracking slightly. "You okay?" The figure didn't move at first, then slowly lifted his head to look at us. Even from a distance, I could see his eyes wide, almost unblinking, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Confusion? Whatever it wasn't normal. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I'm fine." He didn't sound fine. His words were coherent, but there was a strange detachment in his tone, like he wasn't fully present. We asked him where he'd come from, but he just stared at us blankly and said he didn't want to talk about it. He did, however, say one thing that sent a chill down my spine. "I need to go to a hospital." That was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a flat, matter-of-fact statement. My friend pulled out his phone and called 911 while I stood there, trying to process what was happening. I couldn't take my eyes off the guy. The way he was sitting, the way he spoke. It was like he'd been dropped there, like he didn't belong in this world. We tried to talk to him while we waited for help to arrive. I offered him my jacket, which he accepted without a word. When I asked him what had happened, he just shook his head and muttered something about not wanting to talk about it. He didn't seem drunk or high, just disconnected. At one point, he looked up at the sky and asked my astronomy enthusiast friend about constellations. It was such a bizarre question given the circumstances, but my friend answered anyway. The guy nodded thoughtfully, as if the answer meant something to him, though I couldn't imagine what. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, accompanied by an ambulance. The guy stood up slowly, still clutching my jacket around his shoulders. The officers asked us a few questions, where we'd found him, how long we'd been there, but we didn't have much to tell them. The paramedics checked him over briefly before helping him into the ambulance. Before they closed the doors, he turned to us and asked for our names. I hesitated but gave mine, and so did my friend's. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, then said, "Thank you." And that was it. He was gone. The next morning, over breakfast, we told the story to my friend's family. As we recounted the events, the memory of the light in the sky came flooding back. My friend made the connection immediately, but I brushed it off. A strange light and a strange man showing up in the same field on the same night? It felt too coincidental, too ridiculous to entertain. His family, while polite, didn't take it too seriously. They chalked it up to a run-in with a troubled person, a junkie maybe, or someone suffering from a mental health crisis. I wanted to believe that explanation too. It was easier than the alternative. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. How had he gotten there without us seeing him? Why was he barefoot and shirtless, in near freezing temperatures? And why did he seem so detached, so otherworldly? I'll never know the answers to those questions, and maybe that's for the best. The rest of the trip was uneventful, filled with good food, laughter, and the warmth of family. For a while, I managed to forget about the man in the field and the light in the sky. But every so often, on a clear night, I find myself looking up, searching for something I can't quite explain. And in the back of my mind, I hear his voice. Thank you, for what I still don't know. Redditor 4. There's a strange intimacy to the silence of night, the way the world feels like it's holding its breath just for you. It's in those moments, lying in the dark with only the sound of my own breathing, that the nightmares used to creep in. Not nightmares like falling or being chased by faceless monsters. No, these were different. These were alien. I don't believe in aliens that abduct people, let me say that right now. I've never been one for conspiracy theories or late-night TV specials about UFOs. But for as long as I can remember, I've had these dreams. Vivid, unsettling dreams about the Greys. The classic ones with their oversized heads, almond-shaped black eyes, and spindly limbs. They never spoke, never touched me, but their presence filled me with a dread I could never quite put into words. It was the kind of fear that takes root deep in your gut and doesn't let go. The dreams always started innocuously enough. I'd be somewhere mundane, like my childhood backyard or a bustling vacation spot. Everything would feel normal, even pleasant, until I noticed the UFO. It would hang in the sky like a second moon, silent and menacing. I'd feel it watching me, though I never knew how I could be so sure. Then the Greys would come. Their approach wasn't loud or dramatic. They didn't burst out of the ship or descend on beams of light. They would simply appear, as though stepping through the fabric of reality itself. And with them came the fear, so overwhelming it was like a physical force pressing down on my chest. It wasn't just terror of the unknown. It was as if they reached inside my mind and found every buried fear, every secret vulnerability, and dragged it to the surface. In these dreams, I always tried to run. It was instinctive, primal, as if every fiber of my being screamed at me to get away, but I couldn't. My limbs would feel heavy, like they were moving through molasses. My vision would blur, the world around me tilting and spinning. It was as if the Greys were in my head, unspooling my sense of reality thread by thread. The closer they got, the more I felt myself slipping into some dark, endless void. Then, nothing. The dream would end, and I'd wake up in my bed, gasping for air. The aftermath was almost worse than the dream itself. My heart would race, my body trembling as though I'd run a marathon. The room would feel too small, the walls too close, and I'd sit there for hours, unable to shake the feeling that they were still watching me. Even the thought of the Greys would send shivers down my spine, as if the memory of them carried some lingering, malevolent energy. These nightmares didn't happen every night, but they came often enough to leave their mark. And there was a pattern. They always seemed to happen when I traveled. It didn't matter where I went, a family vacation, a weekend road trip, a business conference. The change in environment seemed to invite them into my mind, as if the unfamiliarity made me vulnerable. For years, I tried to brush it off as nothing more than an overactive imagination. Maybe I'd seen too many Stephen King adaptations as a kid, or maybe it was stress manifesting in strange ways, but deep down, there was always a whisper of doubt. What if it wasn't just my mind? What if there was something else, something real reaching into my dreams and pulling me into their world? One night, I decided I'd had enough. The nightmares were taking a toll on me, leaving me exhausted and anxious. I told myself that if this was just a product of my own mind, then I should be able to fight back. If I couldn't escape the Greys, I would confront them. The dream came as I expected it would. I found myself standing in a field, the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze under a sky full of stars. It was beautiful, serene, but I knew better than to trust it. The light appeared first, a hovering presence that made the air feel heavy and electric. Then came the Greys. They moved toward me in their eerie, soundless way, their eyes glinting like obsidian mirrors. The fear came, too, clawing at my chest, making it hard to breathe. But this time I didn't run. I stood my ground, trembling but determined. As they drew closer, I felt them probing my mind, their presence like icy fingers brushing against my thoughts. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, as if summoned by sheer will, a sword appeared in my hand. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, gleaming and otherworldly, its blade humming with a strange energy. Without hesitation, I raised it and struck. The first Grey fell silently, its body crumpling as if it were made of paper. The others hesitated, their movements faltering. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else, something I hadn't felt in these dreams before. Power. I swung the sword again and again, cutting through them as they advanced. Their bodies dissolved into nothingness with each strike, leaving me standing alone in the field. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat. my chest heaving as though I'd just fought a battle. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. The Greys were gone, and I knew, somehow, that they wouldn't be coming back. It's been 3 years since that night, and the nightmares haven't returned. I'd like to believe that I conquered some deep-seated fear, that my mind found a way to heal itself. But every now and then, I catch myself wondering, what if they were real? What if I didn't just defeat a figment of my imagination, but something else, something that had been invading my dreams for reasons I'll never understand? I don't have answers, and I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that the Greys are gone, and I can finally sleep without fear. Whether it was just my mind or something more, I fought back, and I won. Redditor 50. The stillness of the house at 4 a.m. had a certain weight to it, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards feel like an echo of something unnatural. I wasn't even fully awake, just wandering down to the kitchen in that groggy haze, my throat dry and my body on autopilot. It was a cold night, the kind where the frost on the windows seemed to crawl inward. I barely noticed it, though. All I wanted was a glass of water. I was halfway through filling my glass when I heard it, a low, deep buzzing sound. At first I thought it was something inside the house, maybe the refrigerator acting up or a neighbor's generator humming faintly through the walls. But as I stood there, the sound didn't just persist. It seemed to pull me. It was coming from outside. For a moment I hesitated. It was 4 a.m, pitch black out there, and freezing, but curiosity tugged harder than caution. I put the glass down, grabbed my jacket off the back of the kitchen chair, and opened the door to the backyard. The second I stepped outside, I felt it. The air was thick, charged, like the atmosphere just before a thunderstorm, but there wasn't a cloud in sight, just a cold, star-filled sky. The buzzing sound was louder now, and as I scanned the backyard, my gaze shot upward. And there it was. A bright, rounded object was hovering above me, maybe 600 feet up. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. It wasn't like a plane or a drone. It was perfectly round, glowing faintly, its light pulsating in slow, rhythmic waves. I froze. My body locked up like some invisible force had hit the pause button on me. My legs wouldn't move, my arms felt like lead, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't even blink. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. Seconds? Minutes? Time felt slippery, as if it didn't matter under the glow of that thing. The buzzing grew louder, vibrating in my chest like a sound I could feel more than hear. Then, without warning, the object began to rise. Slowly at first, almost as if it were reluctant to leave, and then, boom! It shot upward at an incredible speed, slicing through the cold night air and vanishing into the clouds above. Just like that, it was gone. The paralysis lifted, and I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My legs felt like jelly, my hands trembling uncontrollably. For a moment I stood there, trying to process what I'd just seen. A plane? No, it moved too fast. A drone? No, it was too big, too smooth, too otherworldly. I didn't even realize how cold I was until the chill started biting at my skin. I shuffled back inside, locked the door behind me, and sat at the kitchen table. The glass of water I'd left there was still half filled, and for some reason, that little detail grounded me. I downed it in one gulp, trying to steady my nerves, but the image of the glowing object was seared into my mind. I eventually went back to bed, though sleep was the last thing I expected to find, but somehow exhaustion took over and I drifted off. That's when the dream came. In the dream, I was back outside, standing in the exact spot where I'd seen the object, except this time it didn't stay at a distance. It descended slowly, its light growing brighter and brighter until I could barely see. Shapes began to emerge from the light. Figures, slender and tall, with smooth, featureless faces and long, spindly limbs. They surrounded me, their presence overwhelming, though they never spoke, or maybe they did, but not in a way I could hear. I felt their words in my head, a series of emotions and images flooding my mind too quickly to make sense of. I tried to run, but my body refused to obey. It was like they were holding me in place, their gaze, if you could call it that, piercing into my very thoughts. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. They moved closer, and the next thing I knew, I was lying on a table in a bright, featureless room. The light above me was blinding, and I could feel cold metal against my skin. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the dream ended. I woke up in a panic, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. My sheets were soaked with sweat, my muscles ached, and I had the distinct feeling that something wasn't right. I chalked it up to the stress of what I'd seen earlier, my mind trying to make sense of it in the only way it knew how. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. What if it wasn't just a dream? The idea terrified me. What if they'd really been there, and the dream was just a way to cover it up, to make me dismiss it as nothing more than my imagination? It sounded crazy, paranoid even. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that glowing object, heard that low buzzing sound, felt the icy grip of fear that had paralyzed me. For days after, I couldn't focus on anything. Every shadow, every strange noise made my heart leap into my throat. I didn't tell anyone, not my family, not my friends. Who would believe me? It was easier to bury it, to pretend it hadn't happened, even as it gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Now, when I think back on that night, I still don't know what to believe. Was it just a strange coincidence? A vivid dream triggered by the shock of seeing something unexplainable? Or was it something more, something real? I'll probably never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I haven't looked at the night sky the same way since. Redditor 6. The story my family told me only twice still lingers in my mind, a tale shrouded in unease and whispered disbelief. It was during a quiet summer evening at the family cottage when I dared to ask about it again. The first time I heard it, the details were vague, almost hesitant, as if the story itself was too absurd to be spoken aloud. But that second time, with the family gathered and the mood softened by the warmth of shared meals and laughter, they opened up, their voices tinged with the reluctance of people recalling something they wished they hadn't seen. It was sometime in the 1990s. My grandmother and a few relatives had taken a trip from Ukraine to Turkey, renting a small cottage nestled along the coastline. It was far from the tourist crowds, remote enough that the only sounds were the gentle lapping of the sea and the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse trees. They had wanted peace, a break from the humdrum of daily life, and this little seaside haven promised just that. But peace wasn't what they got. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep, velvety blue, the dogs began barking. Not the playful yips of excited pets, but guttural, frantic barks that clawed at the air like a warning. The sound was sharp and relentless, cutting through the stillness of the night. My grandmother's brother, a practical man who rarely entertained flights of fancy, went outside to investigate, expecting perhaps a stray animal or a wandering villager. What he saw froze him in his tracks. Hovering in the sky, descending slowly but deliberately, was a triangular object. Its edges were sharp and precise, outlined by 3 lights, one at each corner, that glowed with an intensity that seemed almost alive. The lights didn't blink or waver like those on an airplane. They were steady, casting an eerie, otherworldly glow over the landscape. The object itself was enormous, larger than anything he'd ever seen in the sky, and it moved with an unnatural smoothness, as though gravity held no sway over it. He called for the others. "Come out here, you need to see this." The rest of the family filed out hesitantly, their faces shifting from curiosity to alarm as they looked up. There it was, a triangular craft, hovering silently but with an undeniable presence, as if it carried with it the weight of something not meant to be seen. My grandmother, usually the picture of composure, clutched at her scarf and whispered hurried prayers under her breath. One of the children started to cry, his small hands gripping tightly onto his mother's dress. The dogs' barking grew frenzied, their howls echoing into the night as if they sensed something far beyond human comprehension. The object descended further, its lights casting a stark, cold glow that illuminated the cottage and the surrounding area. The family stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear their eyes away. Then the vibrations began. The ground seemed to hum, a deep, resonant frequency that traveled through their feet and into their bones. The walls of the cottage shuddered violently, and the air was filled with the sound of breaking dishes and rattling furniture. My grandmother's brother swore he felt his teeth vibrating in his skull. a sensation so unnatural it left him momentarily stunned. "Get inside," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. They scrambled back into the cottage, slamming the door shut as though a few inches of wood could protect them from whatever was outside. Inside, the vibrations were even worse, the entire structure groaning under the pressure. The family huddled together in the center of the room, their fear palpable. The lights from the craft seeped through the cracks in the curtains, casting strange, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. Minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. The object continued to hover above the cottage, its presence suffocating, as if it were studying them, deciding something they couldn't possibly fathom. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to ascend. The vibrations lessened, the light dimmed, and the craft rose higher and higher until it disappeared into the night sky, leaving nothing but an unnatural silence in its wake. The family sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. No one spoke. No one moved, each of them processing what they had just witnessed. My grandmother's brother eventually stood, his hands trembling as he straightened a picture frame that had fallen from the wall. "It's gone," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The next morning they ventured outside to survey the damage, broken dishes, scattered furniture, and the dogs, who refused to leave the safety of their small shelter. The ground where the craft had hovered seemed untouched, but the family swore the air felt heavier, the atmosphere charged with something they couldn't explain. Years later, when I first heard the story, the family's reluctance to discuss it was obvious. They were rational people, deeply rooted in tradition and skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by logic or faith. To them, speaking of what they had seen felt like inviting ridicule, or worse, as if acknowledging it would make it more real. But the way they spoke, the way their voices dropped and their gazes grew distant, convinced me they were telling the truth. Even now, the story lingers in my mind. I picture the triangular craft, the way it loomed over the cottage like a silent predator, and the unshakable fear it left behind. My family doesn't tell the story anymore, and I've learned not to bring it up. But on quiet nights, when the world feels still and the stars seem unnervingly bright, I find myself looking up, wondering if it's still out there, somewhere in the vast expanse of the unknown, watching. Redditor 7. The worst nightmare of my life began in the most mundane way, lying in my bed, tangled in the familiar embrace of childhood safety. I was 8 years old, the kind of kid who had mastered the art of pretending to be asleep. It was a talent born out of necessity, a trick to skip CCD mass, to avoid chores, to feel the sweet surrender of being carried inside after a long car ride. That night, I used my well-honed skill, but this time, not for playful deception. This time, I was pretending for survival. It started with a sound, barely audible, but enough to pull me from the edge of sleep. A soft scrape, the subtle creak of my bedroom window shifting on its hinges. My eyes remained tightly shut, my breathing carefully even, as I waited for the sound to reveal itself as harmless. Just the wind, maybe a stray branch. But then I felt it, the weight of a presence, dark and heavy, stepping into my room. I dared not open my eyes. Instead, I played my part, every muscle frozen as though I were a lifeless doll. It had worked before, when I wanted to trick my babysitter into thinking I was sound asleep. But this time, it wasn't a babysitter hovering over me. It was something else, something wrong. Without a word, I was lifted from my bed. The air around me felt electric, alive, like the charge before a thunderstorm. I realized with a deep, sinking dread that this wasn't just a dream. But it had to be, didn't it? My rational mind fought against the growing terror. My eyes stayed shut, clinging to the illusion of control. But the sensation of being carried was too real, too vivid. Then came the ascent. I felt it in my stomach first, that weightless sensation you get when an elevator moves too quickly. The air grew colder, sharper, pressing against my skin in a way that no dream could replicate. I knew I was rising, though I couldn't say how or to where. When I finally stopped, I opened my eyes, and everything changed. The room I found myself in defied comprehension. The walls glowed faintly with a reddish hue, pulsating like a living thing. The air was thick, almost liquid, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. Shapes and symbols floated in and out of view, their geometry impossible to pin down. It was otherworldly, alien in every sense of the word, and yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. Before I could process what I was seeing, I felt a sharp pinch on the back of my left hand, followed by a similar sensation on the palm of my right. It wasn't pain exactly, but an invasive discomfort that left me trembling. My body felt like it was on the edge of shattering, as though the very act of being in that room was pulling me apart piece by piece. And then, blackness. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as though I'd run miles. The moment I opened my eyes, the urge to cry overwhelmed me. It wasn't a typical post-nightmare fear. It was primal, uncontrollable, like something deep inside me had been violated. I ran downstairs, desperate for comfort, and collapsed into my babysitter's arms. She held me tight, murmuring reassurances that it was just a bad dream. At the time, I believed her. What else could it have been? It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed the scars. On the back of my left hand was a small, raised mark, the skin pink and angry as though it had been burned. But the real shock came when I looked at my right palm. Beneath the skin, just below the surface, was something hard and round, a tiny metal object no bigger than a ball bearing. I pressed against it, and the skin bulged slightly, a strange sensation that sent shivers up my spine. It wasn't supposed to be there. It couldn't be there. I showed my parents, my babysitter, anyone who would listen, but their reactions were always the same, a mixture of dismissal and mild concern. It's just a wart, they said, a harmless cyst. But I knew better. Whatever it wasn't normal. It wasn't me. Over the next few years, the object became a constant presence, a quiet reminder of that night. Sometimes it would irritate my skin, causing it to bubble and redden around the edges. Other times it seemed to hum faintly, a vibration so subtle I could barely feel it. What truly unsettled me, though, was how it reacted to certain environments. In church, near airports, or even standing too close to a circuit breaker. The irritation would spike, the skin around it growing hot and swollen. Doctors were baffled. X-rays showed nothing, and every explanation they offered felt hollow. I never had it removed. Part of me was terrified of the idea of anesthesia, of what they might find, but another part of me liked it. It made me feel different, special in a way that I couldn't quite articulate. It was a secret, something that belonged to me alone, even if I didn't understand it. Then, 5 years after that night, the metal object fell out on its own. I had been scratching at my palm absent-mindedly when I felt a sharp sting, followed by the sensation of something small and hard pressing against the skin. With a final, painful push, it emerged. A tiny sphere of black metal, smooth and cold to the touch. It was smaller than I remembered, barely half the size of a BB, but its surface was covered in intricate patterns. Tiny indentations like the dimples of a golf ball, with a faint groove running around its middle. I held it in my hand, staring at it in disbelief. For years it had been a part of me, and now it was gone. I wanted to show it to someone, to demand answers, but as I turned it over in my fingers, it slipped free. I watched in horror as it spun across the bathroom sink, bounced once, and disappeared down the drain. My chest ached with the loss, a strange grief that felt heavier than it should have. I stared at the empty space in my palm, where the skin was now slightly grayed, as though the metal had left an indelible mark on me. The scar on the back of my left hand was still there too, smaller but no less real. They were reminders of a night I could never fully explain, a mystery that had shaped me in ways I didn't yet understand. To this day, I believe it was aliens. I've read the skeptics, heard the arguments about sleep paralysis and overactive imaginations. Maybe they're right. But I can't shake the certainty that what happened to me was real. The scars are real, the metal was real. And the memory, the glowing red room, the feeling of being seen, is as vivid now as it was all those years ago. I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that the world is far stranger than we like to admit, and sometimes the truth leaves a scar. Redditor 8. The first time I was taken was in 1987. I was 12 years old. I say taken, but it's not exactly like that. It's not like you're dragged away kicking and screaming. You go willingly. It's terrifying at first, yes, but it's also strangely exciting. They make you feel okay about it somehow. It's only later, when you're back in your own bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process it all, that you feel violated. And no, they don't do the kind of probing nonsense you see in movies. That's all Hollywood exaggeration. What they do is different, clinical, detached. The first time I was lying in bed when the room became impossibly still. It's hard to explain unless you've felt it. The air changes, becomes thicker, charged with an energy you can't ignore. Before I knew what was happening, they were there. They don't come through doors or windows, they just appear. The little ones, about 3 feet tall, their heads disproportionately large for their frail, slender bodies. Their skin isn't gray, like everyone seems to think. It's more of a beige, almost putty-like texture, smooth and featureless. They took my hand, their long, spindly fingers curling around my wrist. I remember being too stunned to resist, too curious to be afraid. They led me somewhere, a room that didn't feel like a spaceship or anything futuristic. Just a plain room. The walls glowed faintly, and I quickly realized they weren't walls at all, at least not in the way we understand them. They seemed to be alive, pulsing gently, scanning everything in the room, including me. It felt invasive, like they were peeling back layers of my skin with their gaze, though they never touched me in any harmful way. They asked me questions, not with words, at least not in the traditional sense. The communication was telepathic, and their thoughts slipped into my mind with a clarity that was almost unsettling. "Do you understand this?" they would ask, showing me images, videos, even scenes from what looked like television shows. They wanted to know my reactions, how I felt about what I was seeing. Their language, though, is incomprehensible. It's not even close to anything human. It's a low hum, almost like the sound of a trumpet muffled underwater. I could tell they didn't expect me to understand, but they seemed to enjoy making the noises anyway, as if practicing some strange habit they'd picked up. They could understand me when I spoke, though I had to talk slowly and loudly. They weren't great at picking up nuance. Over time, I got used to the routine. Every couple of years, they'd take me again. They'd ask more questions, run their scans, and sometimes take tissue samples. That part wasn't fun. They didn't use anesthesia. They had these small, needle-like devices that would punch into my skin and extract tiny chunks, like a biopsy. Usually it was from my lower back or thigh. It hurt, but not in a screaming, unbearable way, more like a deep ache that lingered for days. 2 of them became familiar to me over the years. They told me to call them Jack and Jenna. I don't think those were their real names, just something they thought would make me more comfortable. I couldn't tell if they were male or female or if those concepts even applied to them, but they seemed kind in their way. Jack was more curious, always asking questions, while Jenna had a calming presence, as if she knew when I was scared and wanted to ease my fear. They showed me things that shook my understanding of history. Videos of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons building simple structures, their dark skin glistening under a foreign sun. They showed me the pyramids being built, massive stones moving in ways that defied explanation, and another ancient structure I didn't recognize, something enormous, intricately carved, that seemed European. They said it was lost, destroyed long ago. They also played music sometimes. Bluegrass seemed to fascinate them. They loved the sound of string instruments, especially the African kora, but they couldn't stand horns. Jazz and classical music irritated them, and I got the sense that trumpets in particular reminded them of something unpleasant. I never asked why. Asking them questions was a mistake. I learned not to repeat. It made them agitated, and their calm, neutral demeanor could shift into something cold and disapproving in an instant. The longest I ever stayed with them was 3 weeks. During that time, they allowed me to make phone calls to keep up appearances. "Your world must not notice your absence," they explained, though they never said why. I learned to mimic normalcy during those times, but the act of returning to the human world after being with them always left me feeling disconnected, like I was caught between 2 realities. In 2021, they said, everything would change. They told me they planned to make themselves known, to reveal their presence on a global scale. They weren't clear about the details, only that the date would be in July, possibly the 8th or the 18th. They weren't trying to scare me, and there was no sense of threat in their words. If anything, they seemed curious about how humanity would react. "We are not dangerous," Jenna assured me once. "We have no need for your resources. Your world offers us nothing we do not already have." Their home, they said, was both unimaginably far and disconcertingly close. Too far for you to understand, Jack explained once, but also close to the side. I've spent years trying to make sense of that statement, but it remains a riddle I can't solve. What strikes me most, even now, is their apparent lack of malice. They aren't trying to conquer us or harvest our resources. They don't seem interested in breeding with us or altering our genetics. They are simply studying, observing, learning. But for what purpose, I can't say. The last time they took me was only a few weeks ago. It followed the usual pattern, the silent abduction, the questions, the scans. But this time felt different, heavier somehow, as if the weight of their plans was pressing down on me. I tried to ask them what would happen in 2021, but they waved the question away with a gentle hum, their version of a sigh. They'll know soon enough, Jenna said. Since then, I felt a strange anticipation, a gnawing sense that my time with them might be nearing its end. I don't know what will happen when July 2021 arrives. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But I hope, whatever it is, that the world is ready. For all their mystery, for all the fear and confusion they've caused me, I don't think they mean us harm. If anything, they seem as curious about us as we are about them. And maybe, just maybe, that curiosity is enough to bridge the unfathomable distance between their world and ours. Redditor 9. 2 years ago, on a warm August night in northern Massachusetts, I was out walking my old dog Max. He was a big, lumbering golden retriever whose joints creaked almost as much as mine did on that cool, damp night. The Atlantic breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the salty scent of the ocean. This was one of our favorite times, just Max and me strolling under a blanket of stars, away from the hum of human activity. The sky was exceptionally clear that night. It was the kind of night where the heavens seemed close enough to touch, where even the faintest stars revealed themselves, twinkling like tiny promises scattered across the darkness. I'd always loved nights like this. Here in northern Massachusetts, light pollution was minimal, and the stars could perform their nightly show without the competition of man-made brightness. We stopped by a little bench tucked into the path near the edge of a grove. Max sat heavily by my feet, his tail wagging lazily, brushing the gravel as if to say, "Take your time." I reached into my jacket for a cigarette and flicked my lighter. That first inhale burned pleasantly, grounding me as I gazed up at the sky. The constellations I'd grown up with winked down at me like familiar old friends. The North Star glimmered like a beacon, steady and sure. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought they were satellites. I see them often enough, small, steady lights tracing a straight path across the sky. But these weren't satellites. These were different. Two faint objects, almost indistinguishable from the stars themselves, were moving in a way that defied anything I'd seen before. They weren't following the clean, linear paths of satellites or the tumbling arcs of space debris. Instead, they wove around each other, like two fireflies performing a delicate dance in the heavens. I froze, my cigarette forgotten in my hand as I watched the tiny lights drift apart, then back together again. They moved with purpose, yet there was a fluidity to their motion that suggested freedom, almost like they were playing. Max seemed unbothered, his nose resting on his paws as he let out a contented sigh. But I couldn't take my eyes off the sky. For a moment, the two lights stopped and hovered in place, suspended against the infinite black canvas. It was as if they were observing me, or perhaps everything below. My breath hitched, and I felt a pang of something unfamiliar, an overwhelming sense of connection. Not fear, not awe, but a profound sense of love and recognition. I couldn't explain it, even to myself, but it was as though these distant lights, whatever they were, had reached across the vastness of space and touched my very soul. They began to move again, weaving their intricate patterns with a grace that seemed almost deliberate, as if to tell me something. But what? I didn't know. I couldn't even be sure how much time had passed as I stood there, rooted to the spot, my head tilted back and my heart pounding softly in my chest. And then, nothing. It's the strangest thing. One moment I was watching them, feeling this incredible warmth, and the next, I was back in my house, Max curled up on his bed in the corner, snoring softly. I don't remember walking home. I don't remember leaving the bench. It's as if my mind simply skipped a chapter in the story, and when I woke up the next morning, I wasn't even sure if it had been real. But there was one thing I knew for certain. That feeling I'd had, that connection, stayed with me. It wasn't fear or confusion, as you might expect from witnessing something so unexplainable. It was joy, pure, unfiltered joy. The kind you feel when you see someone you've missed for years, or when you look at a loved one and realize just how deeply they mean to you. For days afterward, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Were those lights some kind of aircraft? Something experimental that the government was testing in secret? Or had I caught a glimpse of something far greater than myself? Beings from another world, reaching out in the only way they could? I couldn't say, but I couldn't shake the idea that, whoever or whatever they were, they understood us, not in the way we understand a scientific formula or the mechanics of a machine, but on a deeper, more emotional level. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who would believe me? I saw two little lights in the sky and they filled me with love. It sounded ridiculous, even to me, but as the months passed, I found myself thinking about that night more and more. Each time, I felt that same warmth, that same quiet reassurance that we aren't alone. And that maybe I've always considered myself a seeker of truth. I've spent my life searching for meaning, for connection, for love, in all its forms. And on that night, standing under the stars with Max by my side, I felt like I found it. Or rather, like it found me. It wasn't the kind of truth you can write down or share in a debate. It wasn't a scientific discovery or a groundbreaking revelation. It was a truth that existed purely in the heart, a quiet reminder that somewhere out there, beyond the stars, there are others who understand us in ways we can't even begin to comprehend. Every now and then I look up at the sky and wonder if I'll ever see those lights again. Part of me hopes I will, though I know that moments like that can't be chased or forced. They come when you least expect them, like a gift from the universe, and all you can do is be grateful. I don't tell this story often. It's not something I want to explain or defend. It's something I carry with me, a private piece of wonder that reminds me of how vast and interconnected everything truly is. Whether those lights were from another world or simply a trick of the atmosphere or even a figment of my imagination, I'll never know. But I do know one thing. For that brief, impossible moment, I felt seen, I felt loved, and that's a feeling I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Redditor 10. Herbert Sherman had always been the kind of man who prided himself on being rational, grounded, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by logic and reason. As a highway patrolman in the late 1970s, his life revolved around facts. Speed limits, traffic violations, and the occasional drunk driver who needed escorting off the road. His sharp instincts and unflappable demeanor made him a trusted figure in his small Midwestern town. But one night, while driving a lonely stretch of highway under a star-speckled sky, Herbert experienced something that would shake the foundations of his carefully ordered world. It was a quiet night, the kind patrolmen often described as easy. The air was cool and the road was empty save for the occasional passing semi. Herbert's radio crackled with the idle chatter of his colleagues, but nothing of importance broke the monotony. He rolled down the window, letting the crisp night air fill the cabin of his patrol car as he sipped coffee from his thermos. The first sign that something was off came as a flash of light in the distance. At first, Herbert assumed it was a truck, or perhaps the headlights of a distant vehicle cresting a hill. But as the light grew brighter, more intense, he realized it wasn't coming from the road at all. It was too high, hovering in the sky like a second sun. The light pulsed in an unnatural rhythm. Bright, dim, bright again, and cast long shadows across the empty highway. Curiosity and duty compelled Herbert to investigate. He slowed his car, pulled over to the side of the road, and stepped out. The quiet of the night enveloped him as he scanned the sky, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The light was closer now, descending slowly and steadily. It wasn't a plane, and it wasn't a helicopter. It moved with an eerie smoothness, defying everything Herbert knew about aircraft. "Patrol, this is Patrol Car 42, Herbert said into his radio, his voice steady but with a slight edge of tension. I'm observing a strange light in the sky off Highway 67, approximately 5 miles south of the junction. No visible aircraft markers. Over. Static. Then, nothing. Herbert frowned and repeated his message, but the radio remained silent. He tapped it a few times, but the device seemed dead. A chill ran through him, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of genuine unease. His hand instinctively moved to the holster on his belt, though he knew deep down that his standard-issue revolver would be of no use against whatever was happening. The light descended further, and now Herbert could see it wasn't just one light but a cluster of them arranged in a circular pattern. They hovered above the highway, casting an otherworldly glow on the asphalt. He shielded his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The craft, it had to be a craft, was massive, silent, and unlike anything he had ever. Its surface was smooth and reflective, like polished metal, and it seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration that resonated in his chest. And then, without warning, the lights flared to an unbearable brightness. Herbert staggered back, his senses overwhelmed. His vision blurred and his ears were filled with a strange droning hum. His last coherent thought was of his patrol car, its flashing lights now dwarfed by the brilliance above. The next thing Herbert remembered, he was sitting in his patrol car, the engine idling and the radio buzzing faintly with static. He blinked, disoriented, and checked his watch. 3 hours had passed, but he had no memory of what had happened during that time. His coffee had gone cold, and his flashlight lay on the passenger seat as if he'd been holding it and then simply dropped it. The strange lights were gone, and the highway was as quiet and empty as it had been before. Herbert tried to shake off the sense of wrongness that clung to him, but as he drove back to the station, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something had happened, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't until days later, when the nightmares began, that Herbert started to piece together fragments of what had occurred. In his dreams, he was surrounded by light, his body weightless and immobilized. Shadowy figures moved around him, their long limbs and large eyes barely discernible through the haze. He felt pressure on his chest, his arms, his legs, as if they were examining him, studying him. He heard faint murmurs, not in words, but in sensations that echoed in his mind. Disturbed and unable to sleep, Herbert confided in a close friend who suggested he try hypnosis to unlock his suppressed memories. Desperate for answers, Herbert reluctantly agreed. Under hypnosis, the floodgates opened. Herbert described being taken aboard a craft, his body laid out on a cold metallic table. The beings small, gray-skinned, with disproportionately large heads and eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul, worked silently and efficiently. They used strange instruments to examine him, drawing blood and tissue samples with precision. Though he felt no pain, the experience was deeply unsettling. He remembered their touch, their presence, and the sense of powerlessness that gripped him. "Vemi spoke to me," Herbert recalled under hypnosis, "not with words, but in my head. They said I wasn't the first and I wouldn't be the last." The revelation shook Herbert to his core. He felt violated, his sense of safety shattered. He began researching similar accounts and was startled to find that many others described experiences eerily similar to his own. He even agreed to share his story in a documentary, though he insisted on maintaining some level of anonymity. The experience had changed him, not just in how he viewed the world, but in how he lived his life. He became quieter, more introspective, and less certain about humanity's place in the universe. Years later, after his marriage to Herbert's aunt dissolved, his family spoke less and less about the incident. It became a whispered memory, something that people either believed wholeheartedly or dismissed as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too many nights alone on the highway. But for those who knew Herbert Sherman, for those who saw the haunted look in his eyes when he spoke about that night, there was no doubt in their minds that something extraordinary had happened. Redditor 11. The story my high school chemistry teacher told us one lazy Friday afternoon wasn't in the lesson plan. It wasn't a chemical formula or a safety tip for the lab. It was something much stranger, something that left every single one of us wide-eyed and hanging on to every word. He was a serious man, Mr. Hayes. Stoic, punctual, and as far as any of us knew, completely no nonsense. But that day, standing in front of the class with his arms crossed, he told us a story that made the periodic table seem mundane by comparison. "It happened when he was in college," he began, his usual monotone voice suddenly softer, almost nostalgic. He was dating a girl back then, a pretty, shy brunette who loved quiet nights as much as he did. One warm summer evening, they decided to take a walk along the beach in Rhode Island. They weren't alone. One of his best friends had tagged along, bringing his energetic Labrador retriever for company. The beach was empty, the kind of desolate quiet that makes you feel like the world is pausing just for you. The tide was out, leaving behind ripples of damp sand and shallow pools that reflected the stars. They wandered along the shoreline for a while, chatting and laughing as the cool ocean breeze tousled their hair. Eventually, Mr. Hayes and his girlfriend decided to sit by the water, while his friend and the dog ventured into the dunes, chasing some imagined adventure. The moment it began, Mr. Hayes said, he felt it before he saw it. A change in the air, like static electricity prickling the skin, followed by a light moving across the night sky. At first, it seemed like a plane, a bright dot moving steadily overhead, but then it changed. The light grew larger, impossibly fast, as though it were hurtling straight toward them. His girlfriend gasped, clutching his arm, and they both stood, their attention fixed on the expanding brightness. Within a minute, it was there, hovering above the ocean just a few hundred feet from the shore was a massive craft. Mr. Hayes described it as an enormous oval, wider than a football field, with a smooth metallic surface that reflected the moonlight. Around its middle was a ring of lights that pulsed softly in rhythm, colors shifting between blue, green, and white. At its base was a singular bright light, like a spotlight, casting an eerie glow onto the waves below, and it was silent. Absolutely, utterly silent. For 30 seconds, they stood frozen, staring at the impossible object before them. The craft didn't wobble or sway. It hung there with a deliberate stillness that made its presence feel even more surreal. Mr. Hayes recalled feeling a strange mixture of awe and fear, his brain struggling to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. His girlfriend clung to him, her nails digging into his arm, her breath shallow and rapid. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the craft moved. Without a sound, it shot off at a speed Mr. Hayes couldn't even begin to comprehend. One moment it was there, and the next it was a shrinking dot in the sky, disappearing into the vastness of space. The whole encounter, from the first light to its vanishing, couldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. When his friend and the dog emerged from the dunes, their laughter cutting through the stunned silence, Mr. Hayes and his girlfriend immediately told them what had happened, but the friend hadn't seen or heard anything. The dunes, they realized, had blocked their view of the sky and muffled any changes in the air. Shaken but desperate for validation, the couple drove straight back to his parents' house. They recounted the event in a rush of overlapping sentences, trying to capture every detail before it faded. His parents, skeptical but curious, listened quietly. Then his father came up with a plan. He handed them each a blank sheet of paper and a pen, sending them into separate rooms. "Draw what you saw," he said simply. When they returned to the living room, their drawings were almost identical. Both depicted a wide oval with a ring of lights around the middle and a bright beam at the base. Their estimates of the craft's size and distance from the shore were eerily similar as well. Mr. Hayes's father stared at the drawings for a long time before nodding and saying, "Well, I'll be damned." As Mr. Hayes finished his story, he turned to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. With a few quick strokes, he recreated the craft as he'd drawn it all those years ago. The oval shape, the ring of lights, the glowing base, it was all there. He capped the marker and stepped back, his arms crossing over his chest once again. The class sat in stunned silence. No one laughed, no one whispered. For a moment, it was as if the story had pulled us all into that Rhode Island night, standing on the beach, staring up at something vast and unknowable. Finally, one brave student asked, "Do you think it was aliens?" Mr. Hayes shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what it was," he said. "All I know is what I saw." He erased the drawing and turned back to the periodic table, as if nothing had happened. But for the rest of the class, the air felt charged with something more than science. And for me, the image of that ship, its silent descent, its pulsing lights, its impossible speed, lingered long after the bell rang.